At 11:58 in the evening, with 2 minutes left on the clock, the President of the United States picked up the phone. On the other end was the Prime Minister of Canada. Behind that call sat a signed executive order for 50% tariffs on billions of dollars of Canadian goods. An order that, if it went into effect, would have been the first use of a nearly 100-year-old trade law that had never once been triggered in modern American history. This is the story of how Washington backed Ottawa into a corner and how Mark Carney's response reshaped the entire negotiation in less than 72 hours. To understand what happened on that night in August, you have to go back further than most headlines will take you. This did not begin with a deadline. It began more than a year earlier, with a relationship that used to be the quietest, most predictable trading partnership on Earth, slowly turning into one of the most volatile. In February of last year, the United States, under President Donald Trump, reimposed Section 232 tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, citing national security grounds, a mechanism that also swept in Canadian metal, despite Canada being, by a wide margin, the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the American market. According to Global Affairs, Canada's own internal briefing notes, officials in Ottawa called the move unjustified and a clear violation of prior trade obligations, pointing specifically to a 2019 joint statement the two countries had signed on steel and aluminum trade. That 25% tariff was only the opening move. By June of last year, the rate had doubled. President Trump signed off on raising Section 232 duties from 25% to 50%, and Prime Minister Carney, speaking after a meeting focused on stabilizing Canada's metal sector, warned that the escalation risked triggering job losses on both sides of the border, and even talked about the broader risk of a global recession. At that point, Carney announced Canada would set new quotas on foreign steel entering the country and floated the idea of matching tariffs dollar for dollar if a deal wasn't reached within 30 days. It was the first clear signal of a pattern that would define the next 14 months. Washington escalates, Ottawa threatens to match it, and both sides circle back to the negotiating table at the last possible moment. Then came July. In a letter posted directly to his social media platform, Trump told Carney he intended to impose a 35% tariff across the board on Canadian goods, effective August 1st, unless companies moved manufacturing into the United States. The letter carried a specific warning. If Canada retaliated, the tariffs would go even higher. Carney's office confirmed receipt of the letter, but gave little public reaction at the time, a pattern of restraint that would become one of the most talked about aspects of his governing style throughout this entire saga. Behind the scenes, though, there was nothing restrained about what Canadian officials were actually doing. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and negotiators were, according to CBC News reporting, locked in near constant contact with the office of U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer, trying to find any path that avoided the blanket 35% rate. That deadline eventually slipped, not because tensions cooled, but because both governments quietly agreed to keep talking rather than let the tariff wall go up overnight. There's a piece of this story that gets lost in the tariff headlines, and it matters. Earlier in this fight, the Trump administration had also imposed a separate set of tariffs on Canada tied to allegations about drug trafficking across the northern border, specifically fentanyl. Those tariffs did not survive legal scrutiny. In February of this year, the U.S. Supreme Court struck them down. It's a detail worth remembering because it shows that not every tariff threat aimed at Ottawa has actually held up. Some have been reversed by American courts themselves, even as others have proceeded unchecked. By the time this year's version of the crisis arrived in August, the two countries were negotiating against the backdrop of an even bigger structural question: the future of the U.S. to Mexico-Canada agreement, the trade pact that replaced NAFTA during Trump's first term and that is now, under his second term, itself up for renegotiation. As Christopher Gunderman, a fellow in the economics program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, put it, Canada needs that broader agreement renegotiated on workable terms. But you cannot renegotiate an agreement in good faith, while the trade war is actively burning on top of it. That tension, wanting a long-term fix while fighting a short-term fire, is the backdrop against which the events of mid-August unfolded. So here is where the ultimatum actually lands. In the weeks leading into August 19th, the Trump administration signed orders for a fresh round of tariffs, this time not under Section 232, but under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a provision that had never actually been used before in this way. Section 338 allows the White House to impose duties of up to 50% on any foreign trading partner that, in the administration's judgment, discriminates against American commerce. The White House specifically alleged discriminatory treatment tied to Canadian policy on alcohol, automobiles, and dairy products. The scope was significant. Reporting from NBC News and CBC pegged the target at roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. Some reports later put the figure closer to $28 billion, covering items that range from the symbolic to the mundane: wine, hockey sticks, cement, plywood, clothing, milk, and, in one detail widely repeated across coverage because of how oddly specific it was, tongue depressors. Energy products, potash, fish, and critical minerals were notably excluded from the list, which analysts read as a deliberate choice to avoid destabilizing sectors Washington still relies on heavily. The deadline attached to this new round of duties was August 19th, midnight. And unlike some of the earlier threats that had drifted or been walked back quietly, this one came with an unusually blunt framing from Washington. Fix a long list of what the administration called trade irritants, or the tariffs, go into effect regardless. For Ottawa, the timing could not have been worse in one sense and could not have been more useful in another. Just a month prior, at a meeting with Canada's 13 premiers in Charlottetown, Carney had already previewed the posture Canada would take. Everything is on the table depending on the outcome of the negotiations, he told reporters, explicitly including retaliation as an option. Asked directly whether the looming deadline was an opportunity to strike a final deal or simply a pressure tactic from Washington, Carney's answer was blunt. It's both. That framing, refusing to treat the deadline as pure crisis and instead naming it publicly as leverage that cuts both ways, is one of the clearest threads running through Carney's entire approach to this negotiation. He has said, on more than one occasion over the past year, a version of the same sentence: Canada will not accept a bad deal. It's a line he's repeated so often that Canadian reporters now treat it almost as a campaign slogan. But the test of that promise, as trade reporters covering the Washington talks noted, was never going to be in the repetition. It was going to be in the room, under deadline pressure, with a 50% tariff order already signed and sitting on a desk in Washington. That test arrived on Monday, August 17th. With barely more than 24 hours left before the Section 338 tariffs would take effect, Carney spoke with Trump by phone. His office confirmed the call took place in the afternoon, and Carney, speaking to reporters afterward, notably in French, described the state of talks in a phrase that multiple outlets picked up word for word. Very intense and delicate. He added a line that told you exactly how tightly Ottawa was trying to control the narrative in real time. This is not the time to talk about negotiations in public. Behind that carefully guarded public language, according to two industry sources cited by Reuters, one sticking point kept resurfacing above all others: the existing U.S. auto tariffs. Autos are not a side issue in this relationship. They represent one of the most tightly integrated supply chains between the two countries, with parts frequently crossing the border multiple times before a single vehicle is finished. Any deal that left auto tariffs untouched was, by multiple accounts, going to be viewed in Ottawa as an incomplete deal, no matter what else it contained. There was also real economic weight behind why this particular deadline mattered so much more than earlier ones. According to U.S. Census Bureau data cited by NBC News, Canada was the third largest source of imports into the United States in 2025, with more than $380 billion worth of goods crossing the border in a single year. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, in a statement issued the day before the deadline, warned that if no deal was reached, higher tariffs would damage both economies, push up costs for American families, disrupt supply chains already under strain, and put at risk roughly 13 million American jobs tied to the North American Trade Pact. That is not a Canadian estimate. That is the United States' own Chamber of Commerce, warning its own government about the domestic cost of the ultimatum it was issuing. On the Canadian side, business groups were sounding a similar alarm from the opposite direction. Dan Kelly, representing a group with roughly 103,000 members, said many businesses reported the new tariffs could grind their U.S. sales to a halt if they were implemented, and that some American buyers were already holding off on placing new orders simply in anticipation of the duties landing. Kelly specifically noted that these Section 338 tariffs struck differently than earlier rounds. Because so many of the targeted goods were small business, consumer-facing products, rather than heavy industrial inputs, the pain would land on a much broader and more fragile part of the Canadian economy. Politically, Carney was navigating an even tighter needle than the trade numbers alone suggest. Daniel Balin, a political science professor at McGill University in Montreal, put it plainly to reporters covering the talks: Canada's government cannot look like it is simply caving to the Trump administration's demands. That single sentence captures the domestic pressure running underneath every phone call, every intense and delicate comment, every hour that ticked by without a public announcement. Carney wasn't just negotiating with Washington. He was negotiating in front of an audience back home that had spent over a year watching tariff threats escalate, and that audience was not in a forgiving mood. It's worth stepping back for a moment to understand just how unusual Section 338 actually is as a tool, because that detail changes how seriously this particular ultimatum should be read. Section 232, the provision used earlier in this dispute for steel and aluminum, has been invoked repeatedly by multiple American administrations over the decades. It's a familiar, well-litigated tool. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 is not. According to reporting from NBC News, the tariffs that were paused on August 19th would have marked the first use of that particular provision in the modern era. That matters because it signals something beyond routine trade pressure. It suggests Washington was reaching for a legal mechanism, specifically because it offered broader discretion, allowing duties of up to 50% against a trading partner simply judged to be discriminating against American commerce without the narrower national security justification that Section 232 requires. Legal analysts covering the story noted that using an untested provision this aggressively against America's own closest geographic ally and a founding partner in the North American trade bloc was itself a signal of how far Washington was willing to push. The political reaction inside Canada in the days before the deadline extended well beyond Carney's own office. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, whose province carries some of the heaviest exposure to auto sector tariffs, given its integrated manufacturing base with Michigan and the broader U.S. Midwest, publicly backed Carney's negotiating posture, saying he supported the Prime Minister 100% in the talks with Trump. That kind of public, on-camera alignment from a provincial premier, especially one from Ontario, the province with the most to lose if auto tariffs stayed at their existing levels, mattered politically because it blunted one of the easiest lines of attack against Carney, that he was negotiating without full backing from the premiers whose economies were most exposed. The Thursday meeting in Charlottetown, where all 13 premiers gathered with Carney before the deadline, served the same purpose, a coordinated show of national unity heading into the final stretch of talks, rather than a federal government negotiating in isolation. The dairy and alcohol pieces of this dispute deserve a closer look too, because they sit at the center of a debate that predates this specific ultimatum by years. Canada's dairy sector operates under a supply management system that limits how much foreign dairy, including American dairy, can enter the Canadian market without steep tariffs, kicking in above a certain quota. Washington has objected to that structure for years, arguing it locks American producers out of a market they should have fuller access to under existing trade agreements. Provincial alcohol distribution rules work similarly. In several provinces, government-run liquor boards control which products reach store shelves, and American producers have long argued Canadian rules effectively disadvantage U.S. wine, beer, and spirits compared to domestic or other foreign products. Both issues were explicitly named by the White House as part of the discriminatory treatment justifying the Section 338 tariffs, and both appear, based on CBC's sourcing, to be areas where Canada is now offering concessions, including a reported commitment to restore fuller shelf access for American liquor products in provincial stores as part of closing the broader deal. That brings us to the moment the ultimatum actually broke, and where Carney's countermove changed the shape of the entire story. Late on Tuesday, August 18th, with the 50% duties due to take effect at midnight, President Trump posted to his social media platform that he was pausing the tariffs, not canceling them. Pausing them, initially framed around a short window, later confirmed in multiple reports as a 3-day pause, pushing the effective deadline out to Friday, August 21st. Trump's own language in the post was that the pause was based on the progress being made in talks, though he did not spell out full details publicly at that moment. What happened in the hours immediately after that pause is where the real substance of this story sits, and where the reporting, appropriately, gets more careful and more sourced to anonymous officials, because the deal itself had not yet been finalized or made public in full. Multiple outlets, Bloomberg, the Globe and Mail, CBC, CTV News, and the Canadian Press, began reporting, citing people familiar with the negotiations who were not authorized to speak on the record, that the emerging deal would significantly reduce the sectoral tariffs that had been squeezing Canadian steel and aluminum producers. Bloomberg's reporting, corroborated by the Wall Street Journal according to the Canadian Press, indicated the rate on certain steel and aluminum exports would come down from the existing 50% level to roughly 25%, effectively cutting the tariff burden in half. The Globe and Mail sourcing went a layer deeper, describing a structure involving tariff rate quotas, steel facing something in the range of 10 to 15% within an agreed quota, aluminum facing a single-digit rate within its own quota, with much steeper tariffs applying only to volumes that exceeded those thresholds. The same Globe and Mail reporting described a broader shape to the emerging agreement. Trump lowering tariffs on Canadian autos, steel, aluminum, and forest products, in exchange for Canada conceding ground on a list of long-standing American trade complaints: alcohol shelf access in provincial liquor stores, dairy market access, and government procurement rules. A source described to CBC News said part of what Washington wanted in return was a commitment to restore American liquor products to Canadian provincial store shelves, among other concessions still being finalized. Conservative opposition leader Pierre Poilievre, reacting to the emerging terms, offered his own summary of what a completed deal should deliver. That should mean no tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos, and an exemption to Buy American, he said. a marker against which the final formal text will eventually be measured whenever it's actually published in full. On Wednesday, August 19th, the day the original 50% tariffs would have taken effect had the pause not happened, Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer stood together and announced that what they called significant progress had been made toward closing the deal. Greer's own words, delivered to reporters, were notably restrained but pointed in one direction. We certainly, I think, have eliminated some of the irritants that we've had in the past year. LeBlanc, when pressed by CNBC on whether a steel and aluminum tariff reduction was specifically on the table, declined to confirm details, saying only that negotiations were ongoing and that Canada was working collectively with the U.S. administration towards a finalized agreement. Carney's own public statement that evening was true to form throughout this entire process, carefully measured rather than triumphant. Substantial progress has been made, although there is important work still to be done, his office said in a written statement. But by the following midday, in a post on social media, Carney allowed himself a noticeably more confident tone, stating that Canada had entered these discussions with the best overall trade terms, and that the two countries were now moving towards an agreement that reinforces that Canadian advantage, including by securing the best terms in each of Canada's most important strategic sectors, and providing greater certainty about our future trading relationship. Trump, for his part, described the outcome in his own characteristic shorthand, telling reporters the U.S. and Canada have a deal, though, and this matters for anyone trying to track the real, verified state of play, he did not lay out the specific terms publicly at that moment. Asked about the possibility of lowering steel and aluminum tariffs further, Trump told reporters at the White House, "We may bring some of the tariffs down to a level where other countries are," a comment that suggests Washington may be aiming to bring Canada's rates in line with tariff levels applied to other trading partners, rather than granting Canada a uniquely favorable exemption. It's worth pausing here to be precise about what is confirmed and what is still, as of this recording, unconfirmed, because that distinction is exactly what separates a real update on this story from speculation dressed up as news. Confirmed, from named sources and official statements. The 50% Section 338 tariffs were signed, were set to take effect at midnight on August 19th, and were then paused for 3 days by President Trump himself, publicly, via his own social media statement. Confirmed, Carney and Trump spoke by phone in the days leading up to the deadline. Confirmed, LeBlanc and Greer publicly announced that significant progress had been made toward a deal, on the record, with their names attached. Confirmed, the fentanyl-related tariffs from earlier in this dispute were struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court in February. Not yet confirmed and explicitly reported as coming from anonymous sources familiar with the matter rather than from an official released text. The exact final tariff percentages on steel and aluminum, the precise scope of the tariff rate quota structure described by the Globe and Mail, and the complete list of Canadian concessions on alcohol, dairy, and procurement. Multiple credible outlets are converging on similar numbers. The 25% figure for steel and aluminum shows up independently in Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal via the Canadian Press, and CBC's own sourcing, which gives that particular detail more weight than a single unverified leak would carry. But until the full legal text is published and formally signed by both governments, the complete shape of this agreement remains, by definition, provisional. That's also precisely why the story isn't over. Negotiators were reported to have, until Friday, August 21st, to finish the actual documentation behind the deal that had been announced in principle. Trump, notably, has a track record in past negotiations, including with China last year, of demanding late changes to agreements, or, in some cases, walking away from terms that had already been discussed. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's months-long talks with China's vice premier eventually cooled that particular tension, but it took time, and it took the two sides staying at the table well past their first announced breakthrough. There's no guarantee the Canada file resolves any faster, even with a deal in principle already announced. The economic stakes behind all of this go well beyond the specific dollar figure attached to the paused tariffs. The Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association's chief executive, Dan Darby, welcomed the pause when it was announced, but was careful not to overstate what it actually solved. He noted that ongoing uncertainty, not just around the 50% Section 338 tariffs, but around the earlier steel, aluminum, and auto duties that had already been in place for over a year, continued to harm Canadian businesses regardless of what happened with any single deadline. That's an important distinction, because it's easy for a story like this to collapse into a single dramatic night. The midnight deadline, the last-minute pause, when the actual economic damage being described by business groups on both sides of the border has been accumulating gradually, month over month, since the very first steel and aluminum tariffs went into effect back in early last year. There's also a currency and inflation dimension to this story that's been consistently flagged by economic reporters covering the talks. Analysts covering the dispute for NBC News noted that Trump's promised tariffs on Canada threatened higher inflation on both sides of the border, not just in Canada, where exporters would face reduced access to their largest market, but inside the United States itself, where importers and retailers typically pass at least part of any new tariff cost onto American consumers. That dynamic is part of why the U.S. Chamber of Commerce weighed in as forcefully as it did before the deadline, warning specifically about the cost to U.S. families, rather than framing its objection purely in terms of diplomatic relations with Canada. It's a reminder that ultimatums like this one rarely stay contained to the two governments issuing and receiving them. The businesses and households on both sides of the border end up absorbing the uncertainty in real time, often well before any final deal is signed. There's a broader pattern worth naming plainly, because it's the through line connecting every phase of this dispute since it began. Washington's approach across this entire period, the February steel tariffs, the June escalation to 50%, the July letter threatening 35% across the board, and now the August Section 338 ultimatum, has followed a consistent rhythm. Escalate sharply, set a hard deadline, and let the deadline itself become the primary point of leverage. Ottawa's response has followed an equally consistent rhythm on the other side. Publicly restrained language, repeated insistence that a bad deal is worse than no deal, quiet and sustained direct engagement with counterparts in Washington, and a willingness to let the clock run close, sometimes down to the final 2 hours, before either accepting new terms or securing a pause. It's also worth putting Carney himself in context here, because his background shapes how analysts read his approach to this specific standoff. Before entering politics, Carney spent years running two G7 central banks, the Bank of Canada and then the Bank of England, experience that gave him a governing style built around technical, deliberate communication rather than combative rhetoric. That background is visible in almost every public statement he's made throughout this dispute. Measured language, a refusal to escalate rhetorically even when Trump's own posts have been considerably sharper, and a consistent preference for describing negotiations as intense and delicate rather than characterizing them in more adversarial terms. Political analysts covering Ottawa have pointed to that same background as both an asset and a liability in this fight. An asset because it has, so far, kept Canada's public positioning calm and disciplined through more than a year of escalating pressure, and a liability because that same restraint occasionally reads, to a frustrated domestic audience, as insufficiently forceful in the face of repeated tariff threats from Washington. What makes Carney's handling of this particular round distinct from earlier rounds is the specificity of what Canada appears to have actually extracted before the deadline hit. In earlier phases of this fight, the February tariffs, the June hike, Canada largely absorbed the increases while promising future retaliation that, in some cases, was later scaled back or delayed as talks continued. This time, according to the converging reporting from Bloomberg, the Globe and Mail, and the Canadian press, Ottawa appears to be walking away, not just with a paused deadline, but with an actual reduction in the underlying sectoral tariff rate on two of Canada's most economically significant exports, assuming the final text matches what's currently being reported. Whether that becomes the actual final outcome, or whether it shifts again before Friday's documentation deadline, is genuinely still an open question. Fortune's reporting captured attention that will likely define whatever comes next. Canada's own public, increasingly frustrated after more than a year of tariff whiplash, may limit exactly how far Carney's government can go in accepting concessions, even a well-negotiated set of them, without facing accusations at home of having given up too much ground for a deal that could still be reopened by Washington down the line. That domestic political tightrope is, in some ways, the real story underneath the trade numbers. This has never simply been about hockey sticks and dairy quotas. It's been a test of whether a mid-sized economy, sitting next to the largest economy on Earth, can hold a firm negotiating line under direct public pressure from a sitting American president, and still come away with a deal its own public will accept as a genuine win rather than a face-saving retreat. Carney's repeated insistence that Canada would not accept a bad deal was, for over a year, mostly a rhetorical position. In the final 48 hours before that August 19th deadline, it became an actual test, conducted in real time, with a signed 50% tariff order sitting on the table the entire way through. Before we close this out, it's worth naming the sources this reporting draws from directly, because in a story with this much back and forth transparency about sourcing matters as much as the facts themselves, the script drew on reporting and statements from Reuters, the Associated Press, CBC News, CNBC, Bloomberg, the Globe and Mail, NBC News, PBS NewsHour, CTV News, Fortune, the Canadian Press, and Global Affairs. Canada's own published question period briefing notes, along with direct on-the-record statements from Prime Minister Mark Carney, President Donald Trump, Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, and named analysts including Daniel Bayland of McGill University and Christopher Gunderman of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Where specific tariff figures, particularly the 25% steel and aluminum rate, came from anonymous sources rather than an official release text, that distinction has been flagged clearly throughout. And it's worth remembering as this story continues to develop past the point of this recording. If you've been following this trade relationship for a while, you already know it rarely stays settled for long. A pause is not a resolution, and an announcement, in principle, is not a signed agreement. If Washington and Ottawa manage to finalize documentation by that Friday deadline, that's a genuinely different story than the one we're telling right now. And if you want to actually see how this resolves, rather than piece it together from scattered headlines days later, staying subscribed means you catch the update the moment the real text lands, not the moment it gets buried in someone else's roundup. There's also a bigger structural story sitting just behind this one, and it's worth flagging now rather than later. The U.S. to Mexico-Canada agreement itself is up for renegotiation, and everything happening this week is, in many ways, a preview of the leverage both sides will bring into that much larger conversation. Understanding how Carney handled this specific ultimatum, what he conceded, what he held firm on, how long he was willing to let the clock run, tells you a lot about how Ottawa is likely to approach that bigger fight. If that's a story you want broken down clearly as it unfolds, rather than explained after the fact, once it's already old news, subscribing now means you won't have to go looking for it later. And if there's one thing this past year and a half has made clear, it's that neither side in this relationship is finished maneuvering. Trump has shown, repeatedly, a willingness to reopen terms he's already agreed to. Carney has shown repeatedly a willingness to let a deadline run to its final hour rather than fold early. Put those two patterns together, and the honest, sourced answer to, is this over, is simple. Not yet. And if you want to be there the next time this shifts, whether that's Friday's finalized text or the next escalation after that, following along here means you'll have the verified version, sourced and dated instead of a rumor with someone else's spin attached. So here's the actual open question worth sitting with, because reasonable people disagree on it. Did Carney's approach, patient, publicly restrained, willing to let the deadline run to its final hours, genuinely extract a better outcome for Canada than a louder, faster retaliation would have? Or did the 18 months of escalating tariffs that came before this deal mean Canadian businesses absorbed damage that a harder, earlier stance might have avoided? Both readings are defensible with the facts on the table right now. What do you think actually worked here? Patience? Or did patience just cost Canada more time under tariffs it shouldn't have had to accept in the first place? That's where things stand as of this recording. We'll be back the moment the actual signed terms are public.